welcome everyone. You see, we're very busy with technology because this is a hybrid event, remember. So it's very challenging to get everybody hear about us, what's happening in the room from online. And also here we speak from this room can be heard from online as well, right? Clearly, no echo. So that's challenging part for our job. So we're right now kind of testing. And Robert, can you say something? By the way, for organizing this event to be successful, we introduce a co-host system, which means we have an in-person host, which is me, and also we have an online host, which is Professor Robert Gordon. So Robert Gordon is a research assistant professor at the Freedom Center and also fellow of Center for Buddhist Studies. So we're very happy to have Robert as, to be our co-host. And right now I want to let Robert to say a few words and test our system, and also say hello to everybody, say hello to our speaker, Professor Dr. Pat Graham as well. So Robert, can you say a few words?
Well, hello everybody, welcome. I'm actually in Phoenix, Arizona. So it's a little cooler up here, or maybe it's warmer than in Tucson. We're excited here to have Patricia Graham talk. I'm excited to hear a lot about Ōbaku and Sencha. Her work is something that I find very fascinating and has been a big help in my career. And I think everyone's going to really enjoy what's coming at the moment.
Wonderful. So is that okay? I speak. So we're going to start, right? So in 1 minute. So I have a short introduction because this is going to be recorded. So I want to make sure everything runs okay, right? So we will start in a couple of seconds. Is that okay? Jeffrey is ready to go? Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. So my name is Jiang Wu. I'm the director of Center for Buddhist Studies here at the University of Arizona. And welcome to this lecture series. We call that Ōbaku Ingen lecture series. So the reason why we have this lecture series is that because we have a significant event for this year. It is the 350th year death anniversary of a great Zen teacher who went to Japan in 1654. So the year 2022 marks the 350th death anniversary of Zen Master Yinyuan Longqi, or the Japanese will call him Ingen Ryuki in Japanese. He was born in 1592 and passed away in 1673. So this year is the 350th death anniversary of him. And the special ceremonies and the events will be held in both Japan and China to honor this great Zen teacher. In North America, the Center for Buddhist Studies, College of Humanities at the University of Arizona is organizing a series of commemorative events which will run for 1 year beginning May 3rd, 2022. For those who have attended our May 3rd event, we had a launching ceremony and also tea ceremony, and also a lecture. And these events will present and explore the extraordinary life of Zen Master Yinyuan, or Ingen in Japanese, and the great achievements of the Huangbo or Ōbaku Chan or Zen tradition in both China and Japan that Yinyuan pioneered in China and Japan. These events highlight the intersection between religion, art, and the culture in China and Japan, and will be presented in both online and offline formats. Activities will include an online exhibition of a work of art related to the Ōbaku tradition, so you can log online from ingen.arizona.edu. It's an ongoing online exhibition, so you can log in anytime. In addition, we have an academic lecture series. So I call this Ōbaku Ingen lecture series. That's why we have this lecture series. And also music performance. So I want to announce this. We're going to have a pre-recorded music concert for Master Yinyuan in December. Right? So please follow us to receive further notification, and also tea-related events. Right? So this lecture, by the way, is about Ōbaku and Sencha. It's about the tea. Right? So in the future, we're going to introduce more tea-related events. So now let me introduce today's distinguished speaker, and Dr. Patricia Graham. Right? Today, her topic is Ōbaku and Sencha. Dr. Patricia Graham has been the recipient of various fellowships, including those from the Japan Foundation, Center for Global Partnership, the Asian Cultural Council, the Fulbright Program, and the National Endowment of Humanities. Her scholarship focuses mainly on Japanese art, but also began from her graduate school studies in Asian art with an emphasis on Chinese art history and studies Chinese language prior to learning Japanese. Her ongoing scholarly research focuses on Japanese arts, aesthetics, and the design from the 17th century to the present, and the connoisseurship and the collecting of Chinese and Korean art in Japan. Her publications include essays in museum catalogs, encyclopedias, multi-authored scholarly books, scholarly journals, and 3 books. Tea of the Sages, The Art of the Sencha, published in 1998, Faith and Power in Japanese Buddhist Art, published in 2007, and The Japanese Design, Art, Aesthetics, Culture, published in 2014. This lecture series is made possible thanks to the generous support from Wanfu Temple in Fuqing, Lingyin Temple in Hangzhou, China, and also the matcha.com. Right? So we have a distinguished supporter and a sponsor from matcha.com. Please go to matcha.com. If you love tea, you can order tea there. If you want to receive more information about our lecture series and the year-long event, please visit our website at cbs.arizona.edu. So now, without further ado, please join me. Welcome Dr. Patricia Graham.
Yes, got it. Okay. Hello, everybody. Can you see me above this? You might want to go to the side here. I'm short. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm very interested in hearing what you have to say about my talk afterwards. And I'm thrilled to be here to give this lecture for you. So, I've written extensively elsewhere about the development of the Sencha tea ceremony in Japan and its role in facilitating the dissemination of Chinese cultural values and the socio-cultural mechanisms that facilitated its trajectory from the pastime of a small elite group of Sinophile scholars into a formal tea ritual that's still practiced in Japan today. Today's talk will provide an overview of the development of the Sencha tea ceremony in Japan, emphasizing the central role the Ōbaku monks played in nurturing its appreciation, beginning with their drinking of it at temples, then moved on to their role in its popular dissemination, later formalization as a Sencha tea ceremony, and conclude with how Ōbaku head temple Manpukuji reasserted its central role in Sencha's resurgence in the early 20th century. Sencha, which is unfermented green leaf tea prepared by steeping tea leaves in porcelain or stoneware teapot with boiled water and served in tiny cups, is a ubiquitous beverage consumed every day, hot and cold, in Japan today. It also features in a less well-known formal tea ceremony ritual called Sencha-do, the way of Sencha. its drinking and domestic processing is a relatively recent development whose origin can be traced to both ritual and informal tea drinking customs of Chinese monks at Japan's Ōbaku temples. My slide is not forwarding. Oops. Okay, that's on. Okay. According to an account by a Jesuit monk in Japan in the late 16th century, Sencha was then being consumed by Chinese traders in residence in Nagasaki, which was very soon after processing techniques for it had been perfected in China. This detail of a painting on the left is a copy of an older one by the artist's grandfather, Shuseki, an official inspector of imported Chinese paintings, as was this artist, Shusen. Shuseki had studied painting with the Ōbaku monk Iran, who died in 1668, and hereafter I will refer to him by his Japanese name, Itsunen. And generally, I'm going to use Japanese pronunciations for the names of the immigrant Chinese monks I refer to in this talk. The print on the right, though, is much later in date. It shows a nostalgic rendering of the life of Chinese merchants in Nagasaki in much earlier times. Fine sencha only became a beverage of regular consumption in Japan from the time it was first domestically cultivated in 1738, and only after a market for it has been created in large part due to successful popularization and promotion of its benefits by the immigrant Chinese monk Ōbaku Ingen and others who came to Japan. Ingen, the patriarch of this sect, who founded Mampukuji near Japan's famed tea growing locale of Uji, south of Kyoto, is shown here in a masterful portrait, together with one of his Chinese Yixingware teapots preserved at Mampukuji. Ingen and his disciples at Mampukuji drank sencha in accordance with contemporary Chinese Chan liturgical practices. Many Ōbaku religious rites featured the service of sencha, which was also consumed at less formal assemblies for all the monks of the temple and at larger gatherings, which included members of the lay public, as shown here today, on the platform set up in the gravel forecourt outside the Daiyu Hoden is a sencha master reverently serving sencha to the Buddha, whose image is enshrined inside the hall, during the temple's annual large sencha gathering of affiliate sencha schools. Observers seated on the building's veranda are distinguished sencha masters. Members of the public which witness the ritual from the courtyard below. In contrast, powdered tea or matcha, an older Chinese form of preparation for green tea, featuring pulverized green tea leaves whisked with hot water in a bowl, continued to be used at Rinzai temples in Japan, where its service had also developed into the secular Chanoyu tea ceremony by the 16th century. This is the tea ceremony that people most associate with the ritual in Japan today. Special tea rooms for service of Chanoyu had been designed by the late 16th century, and the atmosphere of these, as well as the utensils used for serving matcha, was very different in appearance from those used for serving sencha. In the Chan or Zen tradition, tea also featured as subjects in koan, which are phrases or seemingly illogical questions posed by a Chan or Zen master to their students and meant to spark insights leading to their enlightenment. Ōbaku monks used these in their teachings. The examples here are by Mokuan, Mampukuji's second abbot, and his first Dharma heir, Tetsugyu, first Japanese heir. The phrase, "have a cup of tea," was one that Zhao regarded as the greatest Chan master of the Tang dynasty, said to monks, no matter what was their response to his initial question, and alludes to the fact that enlightenment is found in ordinary daily activities such as the drinking of tea. But Ming Dynasty Chan monks, including those of the Ōbaku sect, did not confine their interest in tea to formal rituals or as subjects of koan. These monks had received Chinese intellectual or literati education, which from the 8th century had incorporated the drinking of green tea as an important stimulus to their spiritual quest that incorporated values derived from the complementary philosophies of Confucianism and Taoism. And in fact, Ōbaku founder Ingen was well known as a master of Taoist divination. By the Ming Dynasty, when the Ōbaku monks arrived in Japan, the presence of tea in literati poetry and painting had become ubiquitous. So in addition to their religious training as directed by Ingen, Ōbaku monks in Japan studied classical Chinese literature and philosophy using books, 61 classics texts in all, which Ingen had brought with him from China. These books were about poetry, Taoist and Confucian philosophies, religion, and history. The diversity of these titles reflects Ingen's literati interest that he encouraged his monks also to pursue. And significantly, one of these books was Lu Yu's 8th century classic of tea, or the Cha Jing. Lu Yu was foremost among Tang Dynasty writers on tea who came to be revered in both China and Japan. He is considered the patron saint of tea. He spent his youth in a Chan temple where he learned how to cultivate and prepare tea. Later, he became a scholar recluse, inspired by the writings of ancient Confucian and Taoist sages, whose influences permeate his classic of tea. The first formal treatise on the subject that extolled its ability to facilitate spiritual enlightenment was what he wrote. Early practitioners of the Cha No Yu tea ceremony knew of Lu Yu, although today copies of his treatise only exist in Ming and later editions. This text influenced the way Ōbaku monks in Japan perceived tea and helps explain why they drank it and wrote about it. Later, Ingen's copy of this treatise served as the model for the first Japanese reprinting and translation into Japanese of this book in the 18th century, which was produced by followers of Sencha in Japan. Concurrent with Lu Yu, another Tang Dynasty Taoist recluse, Lu Tong, is celebrated among Sencha fans for his poem, popularly known as the Tea Song, that conveys the spiritual essence of their devotion to tea. It was nearly always included in Edo period books on Sencha and displayed in scrolls hung in Sencha tea rooms. The central section recounts the poet's growing spiritual exaltation after drinking 7 successive cups of tea. And I'm going to read it to you now, this central section. My bramble gate closed tight against vulgar visitors. Wearing a cap of gauze by myself, I boil and taste the tea. The blue smoke cloud drawn by the wind remains unbroken. A white froth, floating luster congeals in the bowl. With bowl number 1, my throat and lips are moistened. With bowl number 2, my lonely sadness is dispelled. Bowl number 3 cleans out my withered bowels, leaving only 5,000 volumes inside. With bowl number 4, I raise a light sweat, and all the worrisome affairs of my entire life evaporate through my pores. With bowl number 5, my skin and bones are purified. With bowl number 6, I commune with immortal spirits. Bowl number 7, I can barely get down. I only feel pure wind blowing, swishing beneath my arms. The mountain of the Penglai paradise, where can they be found? The master of the jade stream wants to mount this pure wind and go there now. The upper section of this fresh water jar on the left features the tea song poem. The lower section contains imagery of a celebrated Chinese literati gathering called the Gathering at the Orchid Pavilion, or the Lanting, or in Japanese, Rante Gathering, featuring both the tea poem and this celebrated gathering together, closely linked literati activities and ideals to that of tea drinking. The Orchid Pavilion gathering was the earliest and most famous literati party in China, hosted by the celebrated calligrapher Wang Shizhi in the year 353. Over the centuries, many Chinese and Japanese artists illustrated this event, during which 42 guests sat on the banks of a stream into which servants set afloat cups of rice, wine. After plucking cups from the stream and imbibing the liquor, they were obliged to compose a poem. The painting shown here is Chinese and was imported to Japan, presumably through Ōbaku channels, and Mampukuji's seventh abbot, Etsuzan, inscribed it. Several centuries later, it was owned by Tomioka Tessai, an influential Japanese literati painter active into the early 20th century, who was also a fan of Sencha, and I'm going to talk a little more about him later. Much later, this theme was painted by Ike Taiga, a famous literati artist who helped to promote interest in Sencha in Kyoto. Although not directly representing people drinking Sencha, it illustrates the classic literati party of the sort that Sencha enthusiasts took as models for their own gatherings. Taiga, by the way, was a child prodigy and painted works for Mampukuji. Not surprisingly, given its association with Chinese literati, Sencha also inspired literati poems by Ingen and other Ōbaku monks. Recording Enlightenment experiences in poetry had been an important part of the Chan Zen monks' cultural practice for centuries, and Ingen's library assured that his monks would have basic texts available to them to study to understand this important form of spiritual expression. However, he stipulated that his monks should read widely and practice literati arts only after mastering Ōbaku teachings and only if their meditations would not be affected. In addition to serving as a subject for meditation in Zen koan, both Chinese Chan monks and literati scholars composed thousands of verses about tea. So not surprisingly, Ingen's secular writings include many poems about Sencha in his prolific output of about 3,000 verses that are preserved in woodblock printed form at Mampukuji today. Particularly eloquent are a group of 5 poems he composed on the theme of brewing tea with melted snow that are included in volume 3 of his book, Miscellaneous Record of the Old Man. 2 of these are, "In my leisure time, I idly brew white snow tea. This method has been passed down to me alone. The heavenly old men have kindly bestowed upon me this piece of poor land, and yet day after day, jade flowers, tea, come scattering down like snow." And the second poem, it is pleasurable to spend quiet leisure time brewing snow tea, reflecting upon the writings of old Zhao Zhou. Sitting by my gate, I await famous visitors. Then I sip the cup to bring forth poems and literary grace. My activity incites competition from deities who send down snow or heavenly flowers. Ingen may be alluding to these poems in his calligraphy scrolls shown here. The Ōbaku monks' pastime of drinking sencha at odd hours, between meals and in the evenings, was remarked upon by contemporary Japanese writers who visited the Ōbaku temples, apparently because Rinzai-sect monks did not do that. By the early 18th century, sencha had become so closely identified with Ōbaku in general, and Ingen in particular, that the samurai Morikawa Kyoryoku, a Haikai poet, disciple of the famed Matsuo Baso, mentioned Ingen tea or Ingen cha in his Anthology of Customs of 1706, which was a collection of Haikai prose of the Basho school, and subsequently, Sencha was widely described as Ingen-cha. Apart from the obvious differences in preparation techniques, leaf tea drinking represented a different ideological orientation from that associated with the powdered tea ceremony and powdered tea used in Cha no Yu, and also from Rinzai rituals. One of Ingen's Japanese disciples, the priest Getan Docho, first articulated these differences in a lengthy prose poem called Ode to Sencha of circa 1694. And it's too long to recite in its entirety here, though it ends with the following. By Lake Biwa, someone is brewing Sencha. The aroma of the brewing leaves steeps out of the pot. Neither tea scoops nor whisks are needed. Tea is brewed strong and drunk to moisten the bowels. After 3 cups, his spirits are elevated, and he leans on the windowsill to listen to the reed flute. Zen monk friends pass by and inquire about what is taking place there. They're shown teacups as an answer. Zhao Zhou liked to test his visitors. They understood his bluntness and accepted the consequences. Other people can compete for entry into the immortal land of Lutang. I am content to brag about my own fine home. I know that the calligraphy shown here is not about Sencha, but I show it as an example of Getan Docho's elegant Ōbaku style calligraphy. He was, significantly, the first to position Sencha as superior to and in direct opposition to Cha no Yu in his assertion that the early Japanese Zen monks did understand the spiritual benefits derived from the taste of superb quality tea. He wrote that as Cha no Yu became formalized and adopted as an avocation by wealthy samurai and others, the emphasis shifted from the tea itself to an ostentatious display of material possessions, or meibutsu, literally famous things. He implied that only Ōbaku monks and reclusive proponents of Sencha, influenced by them, remained true to the lofty ideals of their predecessors in their preference for fine-tasting tea brewed in a simple kettle in their humble homes. Consequently, in accordance with occasions during which tea was enjoyed by Chinese literati as a private pastime of individuals seeking solace in elegant pursuits, such as reading and composing poetry, practicing calligraphy, and painting pictures, Ōbaku temples did not construct special rooms designed for that purpose, like the tea rooms and tea houses commonly found at Rinzai temples. By the early 18th century, Cha no Yu had become closely associated with the Tokugawa military bureaucracy, which required its vassals to participate in a formal Cha no Yu ceremony as a mandated form of social etiquette. Some Japanese scholars of Confucian and Taoist philosophies found Cha no Yu pretentious and too closely aligned with the ruling policies of the military government. Others, even elite samurai, also objected to Cha no Yu because it invited the mingling of commoners with samurai. Yet the most ardent supporters of Sencha in this formative period were those who enjoyed the taste of steeped green tea because of its association with the ancient Chinese literati, with whom they passionately admired. Drinking the beverage became a symbol of their passive resistance to what they considered a repressive regime. Many of these early Sencha drinkers were inspired in their devotion to the beverage by Ko-Yu Gai, popularly known as Bai Sao, the old tea seller, and formed an informal coterie of admirers around him. Bai Sao was a Japanese-born Ōbaku monk who also was a talented calligrapher and poet of Chinese verse. He extolled the spiritual benefits of Sencha in his poetry. The son of a physician in Western Japan, near Nagasaki, Bai Sao joined a branch temple of the Ōbaku sect near his home at age 12, soon after the death of his father. After visiting Mampukuji and other Ōbaku temples in search of spiritual guidance, armed with introductions to the city's most influential Sinophile scholars and artists, he moved to the Kyoto area in 1724, residing first at Mampukuji until 1730, and then thereafter until his death. He lived in impoverishment in Kyoto, earning his living not as an Ōbaku priest, but as an itinerant seller of sencha that he proffered from a portable bamboo tea utensil cabinet he carried on his back, and which he set up at famous Kyoto scenic spots. The attraction for passers-by was not only his tea's flavor, but his beguiling poetic praises of it. This portrait of him is one of many by an Ōbaku lay priest of Kyoto, Ito Jakuchu, who's a famous painter. They all portray him as an eccentric old sage wearing a Taoist priest's robe and carrying or sitting beside tea paraphernalia. At first, Baisao sold imported tea, but in 1738, a grower in Uji who was acquainted with Baisao initiated its first processing in Japan. Baisao helped his business by lauding its sweet flavor. He called his tea stall Tsusen Te, the pavilion along the pathway to the immortals, and his tea utensil cabinet Sencha, the den of the sages, both allusions to the Chinese literati. His tea utensil cabinet survives, and much later, Tanomura Chokunyu, a sencha fan, literati painter, and Ōbaku monk, pasted an inscription about it inside. We'll return to Chokunyu later. Among Baisao's many poems on the subject of sencha, one he wrote about selling tea at Tofukuji's famed autumn foliage viewing spot of Tsusem Bridge captures the essence of his philosophy and reveals its indebtedness to Tang Dynasty reclusive tea progenitors. Entitled Opening Up Shop at the Tsusem Bridge, it can be translated, setting up for business under a canopy of white cloud in a landscape so rich and rare, Lu Tong would gape in wonder. I have a way that can usher you straight through to the heavens, and it won't take you 6 cups to reach the immortal's abode. The painting of the bridge, by the way, is by Yamamoto Baietsu, who is an important literati artist involved with promoting literati values with his participation in sencha, and I'll mention him again later in this talk. Baisao's talents at poetry and calligraphy, the perceived purity of his spirit, and his unorthodox means of searching for spiritual fulfillment through the medium of sencha impressed the Kyoto public at large, and his tea became a huge hit. Nevertheless, he continued to lead a humble existence, and by doing so, inspired those seeking freedom and individuality within Japan's rigidly hierarchical and increasingly materialistic society. This led Baisao to be counted among the ranks of individuals who became idolized as a kijin or eccentric, people distinguished for their precocity, strangeness, intellectual ability, or perceived spirituality, traits which made them worthy of admiration. After his death, his followers deified him as the founder of their tree tradition, a counterpoint to the position Sen no Rikyu held in the world of Cha no Yu, although he never considered himself a tea master, as did Rikyo, just an itinerant purveyor of tea. I show 2 of many examples of images of him that were made by later followers here. Baisao had very few possessions, but he treasured his Chinese tea wares, some of which I show you here. He described them as his teachers. Not all his possessions were preserved for posterity, though, admonishing his followers not to become infatuated with material possessions, as were followers of Cha no Yu. He burned many of his belongings towards the end of his life, though he saved 19, which he gave or bequeathed to his close supporters. Many survive to this day. Sketches of these were recorded in an album by one of his followers, Kimura Kenkado, a noted Osaka sake brewer, collector of Chinese books and botanical curiosities, literati painter who studied with Ike Taiga, and Sencha enthusiast. Kenkado's son adapted this album into a woodblock book for broader dissemination in 1823, and his father's friend, Aoki Shukuya, another of Taiga's pupils, did the illustrations. The side-handled teapot, a kyusu, shown in this photo, together with the blue and white teapot cups he gifted to Taiga, who I already mentioned. In the woodblock books, it's described as being owned by Kagetsu-an, these things, and I will discuss Kagetsu-an in a minute. And Kagetsu-an had come into possession of this vessel sometime after Taiga passed away in 1776. Another member of Baisao's coterie, Daiten Kenjo, a Rinzai Zen priest at Shokokuji Temple in Kyoto, brushed the calligraphy on his tea stall banner that I show here, that was also reproduced in the woodblock book of 1823. And incidentally, this banner flying along the tea stall was inscribed with the characters Seifu, an abbreviation of the term Seifuryu, pure elegance, to express the literati values that Baisao felt Sencha embodied. The word furyu, literally floating with the wind, had entered the Japanese vocabulary by the 8th century and then conveyed a sense of courtly elegance and refinement. Later, with the ascendance of Cha-no-yu in the 16th century, its meaning shifted to accord with Cha-no-yu ideals that celebrated restraint, humbleness, and simplicity embodied in the expression wabi-cha. Yet by the late 17th century, following Ming Dynasty usages, this word was also used by Matsuo Basho to reference the ideals of Chinese literati who pursued their lives in solitude, devoted to quiet literati pursuits. Daiten and Kenjo were largely responsible for creating a more formal way of Sencha. They did this in 3 ways: by disseminating the philosophy behind brewing methods for Sencha to a broader audience through publication of Chinese tea texts in accessible Japanese language, especially Liu Yu's Classic of Tea that I mentioned earlier, which had been one of the books in Gen's library. Second, they publicized Baisao's tea-making belongings, first in Kenkado's sketchbook and later made into the woodblock book I just discussed. And these utensils became the models for subsequent Japanese utensils of Sencha. And 3, as the center of a wide circle of Sinophile intellectuals, Kenkado regularly held shogakai calligraphy and painting parties, the first in 1770, as regular informal meetings of his Seifu-sha Elegant Society. And he's credited with hosting the first formal Sencha gatherings at these events. The most famous copy of a Baisao-owned vessel was his side-handled kettle that I show you here on the left for brewing hot water. And in China, it was a type of humble vessel used for brewing medicinal herbs. The copy on the right is by the celebrated Kyoto potter and Sencha devotee Aoki Mokubei, who's also a literati painter. He erroneously described it, though, as an example of an Ishinware teapot. One of Taiga's pupils, also a Sencha enthusiast, the priest Geppo Shinyo, is illustrated in a famous garden book of Kyoto preparing Sencha on the veranda of his temple hermitage. This was a sort of informal environment in which these literati enthusiasts of Sencha enjoyed the beverage, and the poem accompanying this illustration describes him as being lost in spiritual discussion and drunk with the golden cup of Sencha. Another of Baisao's passionate followers was Monchu Jofuku, a long-lived Ōbaku monk who left the clergy to devote himself to the promotion of Sencha. He was also a respected scholar and calligrapher, and his inscriptions are found on paintings by literati artists, including those by Taiga and his wife Gyokuran, as well as on paintings by artists of other tradition. Here, an ukiyo-e artist painting of beauties, suggesting his wide circle of acquaintances. The poem on this painting alludes to the fact that the woman, possibly a prostitute, may actually be the Bodhisattva Kannon in disguise, likening her sweet, upturned gaze to this popular, compassionate Bodhisattva. In 1821, Monchu participated in the 150th memorial service commemorating the death of Ishikawa Jozan at his former home in Kyoto, Shisendo, the abode of the poetry immortals, where he briefly stayed. Jozan, a samurai loyal to the Tokugawa clan, had fought in the civil wars that led to the Tokugawa victory and was regarded by Monchu's time as the first Japanese person to live a life in emulation of the Chinese literati and who embodied the spirit of Furyu that was the guiding aesthetic of Sencha. His home has been preserved by followers to this day, and they converted it into a Zen temple. Dissatisfaction with the life of a warrior had compelled Jozan to retire to Kyoto in his 50s, where he settled at this retreat to write poetry in Chinese and study the literature of the Chinese literati tradition. Monchu must have felt that the spirit of this place was an inspiration for the type of open and informal environment in which Sencha should be served, which is a sharp contrast to the small, rustic, enclosed Chanoyu tea rooms that were widely popular in his day. Although Jozan aspired to the life of a Chinese literati and knew of newly arrived Ōbaku monks and their tea drinking traditions, scholars have not uncovered evidence that he actually drank Sencha. In the lineage of the Sencha tea ceremony, Monchu is considered a successor of Baisao and is best known for having taught Ōbaku Zen to Tanaka Kakuo in the Bunsei era, which is 1818 to 1830. Kakuo was a sake brewer from Osaka by profession who had studied Chanoyu in his youth, founded the first formal Sencha tea school soon after 1830s. This portrait of Kakuo by Yamamoto Baitsu, whose portrait of Liu Yu I showed you earlier in this talk, and inscribed by the 29th abbot of Mampukuji, shows him in formal Sencha master attire, a robe like Baisao was known to have worn, and a Taoist crane-shaped cap, clutching a sacred fungus scepter surrounded by his precious utensils, some of which had previously been owned by Baisao. He also, by the way, owned two Sencha objects, a brazier and a tea utensil stand that Ingen had once owned. And these are still owned by his descendants today. In part, Kakuo's success at Sencha propagation happened inadvertently because of his work to expand and improve his family's sake business. During the course of his research, he realized that fine quality water was an essential element in the production of fine sake and discovered that an excellent source existed on his own premises, a well whose water came from a famed spring. His early concern for water quality was widely held as a contributing factor to his later success in brewing fine-tasting Sencha. One of my favorite stories about Sencha and Kakuo demonstrates his extraordinary devotion to the beverage. Yearning for his tea to be as authentically Chinese as possible, Kakuo sought to prepare it using water from China's famed West Lake of Huangbo. Because he could not travel to China himself, it was forbidden by law for Japanese citizens then to travel abroad. He requisitioned water from China via authorities in Nagasaki. Years after submitting this request, 3 bottles containing 18 liters of water each finally arrived in Japan on a Chinese trading vessel and were forwarded to the offices of Osaka's administrators, who notified the surprised Kakuo of their arrival. Delighted, he gathered 10 of his closest friends together to share its bounty. However, they all agreed that to deny others the opportunity to taste authentic Chinese water was selfish. So they devised a plan to share it with the entire population of their city. They decided to place the water in a large, small-mouthed ceramic pot made by the Kyoto potter Mokube, whom I mentioned earlier, and bury it in the upper reaches of a local river. In this way, the precious Chinese water would seep out slowly into the river, which was the city's drinking water source, where it would be consumed in minuscule doses by all. After much discussion with government bureaucrats who had gotten wind of the plan and initially opposed it out of fear that the water would poison the drinking supply, the task was eventually carried out. Kakuo was the first person to adapt rules and nomenclature from Chanoyu to create rules for proper preparation of sencha. These he recorded in a 7-volume manuscript preserved in a Meiji period copy today. It was never produced in printed form and was only used by his direct followers to teach his methods, secret teachings. His drawings show proper utensil arrangements for various social occasions and levels of formality. The 3-mat tea room illustrated here is likely the first room created as a dedicated space for serving sencha. This room at his hermitage, which he called Kagetsuan, the pavilion of flowers and moonlight, is the name of his sencha tea school that still exists at the same location today. There, instead of celebrating poetry immortals, as did Ishikawa Jozan, Kakuo, who was tutored in sencha by the Ōbaku monk Monchu, as I mentioned, and was also familiar with Jozan's Shisendo, instead made his hermitage an homage to ancient Chinese writers about tea. In this illustration, Ōbaku Shibutsu, a celebrated poet from Edo, composed a long poem at the top, just in Chinese, describing Kakuo's wondrous Chinese utensils and his admiration for baisao. The accompanying text in the lower section by the author of the book likens the garden to that of Lu Teng's meandering jade stream garden in ancient China, and notes that the hut featured painted portraits of Lu Yu and Lu Teng and a stone statue of baisao. And in addition to brewing tea for guests, he hosted monthly memorial services for these 3 men, whom he considered the patron saints or immortals of sencha. This is another illustration of Tanaka Kakuo's garden from a famous English language book by British architect Josiah Conder, who came to Japan in 1877 to teach. His book was based on the aforementioned garden manual. The flag fluttering above the abode says seifu, a word closely associated with sencha aesthetics, as I've discussed. In this picture, the calligraphy scroll hanging in the alcove reads, "In the footsteps of the immortals," a reference to the Taoist spirit permeating Kakuo's approach to sencha aesthetics and inheritance from baisao. The open view from the garden into the hut reveals a sencha tea room, and you can see the little sencha tea utensils laid out there. And by the way, the description of this garden in Conder's book was erroneous. He clearly had not studied sencha. Kakuo helped to spread interest in sencha from the Kyoto-Osaka region to other parts of Japan just at the time a new processing technique for the tea was invented in 1838, as seen in this woodblock printed book, done 10 years later by Katsushika Oe, the daughter of the famous ukiyo-e printmaker and painter Hokusai. Because the flavor of this new tea was greatly affected by water temperature and brewing time, Kakuo's rules for preparation helped teach consumers how to brew it properly. This new green leaf tea was called Gyokuro, jade dew. It's the most refined and costly green leaf tea processed in Japan, celebrated for its extraordinary flavor that comes from shading the leaves for a time during the early spring growing season, similar to growing processes used for matcha. Not coincidentally, just after this innovation, the Sencha tea ceremony began to experience its greatest peak in popularity, which even surpassed that of Cha-no-yu for the next 50 years. Gyokuro's marvelous taste was much later eloquently commented on by the novelist Natsume Soseki in his book, The Three-Cornered World, or Kusamakura, of 1906. And there he wrote, "The average person talks of drinking tea, but this is a mistake. Once you have felt a little of the pure liquid spread slowly over your tongue, there is scarcely any need to swallow it. It's merely a question of letting the fragrance penetrate from your throat right down to your stomach. On no account should it be swilled round the mouth and over the teeth, for this is purely extremely cross. Gyokuro tea escapes the insipidness of pure water and yet is not so thick to require any tiring jaw action. It's a wonderful beverage. Some complain that if they drink tea, they cannot sleep. But to them, I would say it's better to go without sleep than without tea." At the time Kakuo lived, emulation of Chinese literati culture had grown quite fashionable, and Gyokuro created increased demand for the tea. These new legions of practitioners sought brewing instruction from experts, and Tanaka Kakuo was one of many who filled this need. Not only did they teach Sencha brewing methods, but they also inculcated their pupils into the aesthetic and philosophical world of the Chinese literati, and in the process created a new tea ceremony for Sencha. The sense of elegance and refinement embodied in the word furyu became their guiding aesthetic principle, in contrast to wabi-sabi that is associated with Cha-no-yu. Teachers at these new Sencha schools, beginning with the one founded by Kakuo, became iemoto, or headmasters of their lineages, and transmitted to their disciples their own interpretations of Sencha preparation techniques in what were initially secret manuals, many first printed for widespread publication in the early 20th century. All these Sencha masters, including Kakuo, borrowed terminology for utensils and devised standardized levels of formality for serving tea on different social occasions, each requiring appropriate types of utensils, from those created for use in Cha-no-yu tea ceremonies. By the early 20th century, the practice of Sencha had become a familiar custom in most cities and towns. In some towns, Kagetsuan and other older schools had affiliate branches, but in others, independent practitioners who had studied at Kagetsuan and elsewhere devised their own methods for tea preparation that they taught to locals. From these small groups grew autonomous ryu schools or lineages which bore only perfunctory relationships to the well-established Sencha schools of Kyoto, Osaka, and Tokyo. About 50 distinct Sencha ryu may have already existed by 1925. While Kakuo's formal style of Sencha had many followers, some fans of Sencha, especially Japanese literati scholars, poets, and artists, did not appreciate his rules. So concurrent with Kakuo's creating rules of etiquette for Sencha, they continued to serve Sencha in gatherings during which they participated in age-old literati activities, brushing paintings, composing poetry, admiring Chinese antiquities. In illustrated books about Sencha published from the 1820s, their style of Sencha gatherings came to be called Bunjin-cha, literati style Sencha, just to distinguish it from the more formal services of the beverage that Kakuo and others were promoting. Only from the 1830s do records of these Bunjin gatherings exist, such as this one I show here. And these individuals were not formally trained as Sencha masters, nor were most Ōbaku monks, but they all knew of and admired the Ōbaku monks' literati inclinations, visited Mampukuji, and modeled their activities on the Ōbaku monks' literati pastimes. And in some cases, they painted pictures in Ōbaku styles as well. In their writings, they recounted the history of Sencha in Japan, and they noted it began with Ingen and was followed by Baisao. The most important of these literati enthusiasts of Sencha was Yamamoto Baitsu, a native of Nagoya who lived in Kyoto for most of his adult life. This era of Bunjin-cha fluorescence coincided, though, with the horrific Tempo famine and pestilence, national disasters that lasted for most of the 1830s and instigated economic and agricultural crises. During this difficult era, the government banned tea ceremonies, and tea itself sometimes became scarce. Baitsu wrote a letter from Kyoto to a friend back home in Nagoya detailing this situation, a revealing commentary on the depth of privations among sheltered, wealthy citizens of the capital. Like many disillusioned and frustrated intellectuals of his day, Baitsu sought solace in his art. Although he was foremost a painter of idealistic Chinese literati themes, he also composed a number of poems in both Chinese and Japanese verse forms, and they voice his fondness for the literati ideal of Hermeticism and appreciation of Sencha. And one reads, "The sound and smell of brewing tea linger in the dead of night. In my small study alone, I roll up my scrolls. Through the gauze window, the moon's pale shadow starts to rise. It's the time that this hermit loves the best." Baitsu was evidently fond of the small study that he described in this poem, for he brushed a number of small sketches of it. He regularly attended gatherings that celebrated the ideals of Bunjin-cha, but he didn't paint actual records of people attending the gatherings. But in one album of his that I show on the right, dated 1844, he features images of flower arrangements in Sencha utensil baskets. In a letter that he wrote in 1840, he described the foodie atmosphere of these sorts of events to a friend. "Last month, on the 18th day of 1840, we held a tea gathering at our mutual friend's villa. There were 5 people attending, and we all sat scattered about the garden and in the house. All the spots were quiet and delightful. Please tell no one about this. People without interest in this sort of thing would only call us fools and laugh." Evidently, he didn't wish for news of this Bunjin gathering to be spread about. He may have additionally been afraid of reprisals from authorities who had banned tea ceremonies. After the demise of the Tokugawa shogunal government in 1868, concurrent with the proliferation of many formal schools of Sencha, literati-style Sencha gatherings continued, and participants included prominent art dealers such as the Yamanaka family, who are well-known antique dealers in the West a little bit later on, businessmen, including the founders of the Mitsubishi conglomerate, and politicians and journalists. These men looked up to the highly respected scholars of Chinese studies in Japan for guidance in how to appreciate Sencha and related arts. Many of them were Bunjin-minded Sencha practitioners, and they attended 2 celebrated gatherings called the Azure Sea Tea gatherings in Osaka, one in 1862 and another in 1874. The latter was held at the Yamanaka antique shop as a memorial to the shop owner's father. Tamnomura Chokunyu, leading literati painter and scholar at the time, who was an Ōbaku monk, created illustrations for woodblock books that recounted these events. The pictures shown here from the book commemorating the 1874 gathering, to which visiting Chinese scholars also attended, show the rooms and objects displayed and used, which included antique Chinese bronzes, Chinese cabinets, Chinese paintings, calligraphies, Chinese furniture, flower baskets, and tea-serving utensils. Some of the book's pages feature detailed illustrations and descriptions of particularly important objects. Essentially, they were connoisseurship studies of them. So in effect, this Sencha gathering should be considered as one of Japan's first exhibitions of Chinese literati arts. It demonstrates the close relationship between appreciation for Sencha and connoisseurship of Chinese literati painting and related antiquities in Japan. This is important to recognize because Japanese collectors and scholars and dealers of these arts in the early 20th century not only influenced appreciation of Chinese art in Japan, but also in the West, where they were dealers, a legacy that has persisted into the present in many collections in Japan as well as overseas. Chokunyu also brushed a set of 3 scrolls of a public Sencha ceremony also held in 1874 in Kyushu that was attended by a whopping 800 people. The government sponsored this event to teach the public principles of civilization and enlightenment, Bunmei Kaika, which at that time still meant Chinese, not Western values, which soon replaced Chinese learning as a standard for educating Japanese citizens for the modern world. The gathering seems to have been more like an art exhibition designed to promote Chinese literati culture. It included not only rooms for the service of Sencha, but others for display of potted Chinese-style plants, Chinese literati scrolls, and scholars' accoutrements. Chokunyu's younger contemporary, the literati painter Tomioka Tessai, with whom he and others formed the Japan Literati or Nanga Association in 1896, must also be mentioned here. Although Tessai did not directly follow Ōbaku teachings, he did more to sustain interest in Chinese literati culture, collecting Chinese antiquities and promoting Sencha than any other artist of his day through his paintings, often featuring landscapes with figures drinking Sencha, or he painted portraits of Baisao. Tessai also admired earlier Japanese literati artists who promoted Bunjin-cha, especially Yamamoto Baitsu, whose Sencha room he sketched, perhaps on a visit there. He's also known for his self-deprecating humor, and as in this painting, a blind man critiquing beauty that features a cabinet in the background with Sencha utensils, perhaps Baitsu's own utensils. Concurrently, though, Bunjin-cha was being surpassed by the proliferation of the more formal schools of Sencha that I mentioned earlier, that by the late 19th century were catering to women, as seen here. Although the teachers of these Sencha schools always invoked Ingen and Baisao as patriarchs of their tea tradition, there was no direct association with Manpukuji or the Ōbaku monks. This changed in 1928 when Manpukuji constructed a memorial hall, the Baisado or Maisado, where monthly commemorative services to Baisao are held, even now, on the 16th day of each month. The temple also erected at that time a Sencha tea house complex, the Yuseiken, the house with voice. A person responsible for repositioning Manpukuji as the source and center of the Sencha tea ceremony then was Fukuyama Chogan, an abbot of Manpukuji's sub-temple of Horin-in. He also conducted the first modern research on Baisao. Because of Fukuyama's efforts, Manpukuji effectively broadened its patronage and boosted its status in ways similar to the benefits Rinzai Zen temples derive from associations with schools of Chano-yu. This relationship has been strengthened in the post-war era with the creation in 1956 of the National Japanese Sencha Association, Zen Nihon Sencha Do Renmeikai, which has been situated at Manpukuji since its incorporation in 1966. The association continues to serve as an umbrella organization for its approximately 40-member Sencha schools, though not all of the nearly 100 Sencha schools that exist today belong. Kagetsuan, which I've talked about, is one of those that doesn't belong. The association sponsors many activities, including since 1955, a large 2-day Sencha gathering, Daichakai, each May at Mampukuji. That event is open to the public. In this festa-like atmosphere, approximately 30 people, visitors, attend and admire antique Sencha utensils and related artifacts owned by members, view exhibitions of Ōbaku arts or contemporary Sencha crafts, attend Sencha ceremonies, as you see here, and purchase utensils, tea books, and tea from vendors. And I want to end with this last slide, a tribute to my professor, Otsuki Mikio, a longtime researcher at Mampukuji's Bukaden, who did more to further the study of Ōbaku and Sencha in recent decades than anyone else, and without whose mentorship, my work on this topic would never have been possible. Thank you.